June 1941, the German Wehrmacht unleashes Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history against the Soviet Union. In the first weeks, the Red Army is caught off guard. Airfields are destroyed, entire armies encircled, millions of soldiers captured. But behind the chaos, the Soviet Union still holds a vast arsenal of weapons. From obsolete tanks of the 1930s, to cutting-edge designs like the KV-1 and the T-34. In this video, we'll take a look at the Soviet weapons that faced the German invasion in the opening phase of Barbarossa. Our story begins with the T-26, the workhorse light tank of the pre-war Red Army. By 1941, tens of thousands had been built. It was slow, thinly armored, and originally designed in the early 1930s, when tank combat looked very different. With armor barely able to stop heavy machine gun fire and a low top speed, the T-26 was hopelessly outclassed by modern German tactics and anti-tank guns. But on paper, the Red Army still relied on these outdated tanks to fill out its formations along the western border. Next is the BT-7A, so-called fast tank. Unlike the T-26, the BT-7 was built for speed. Its suspension allowed it to move quickly over open ground, making it ideal for reconnaissance and deep raids. However, its thin armor meant that it could not stand up to German anti-tank guns or concentrated fire. In the summer of 1941, many BT-7 South were lost not only to enemy action, but also to breakdowns and lack of fuel as Soviet units tried to retreat and regroup. The T-28 was one of the more unusual Soviet tanks on the battlefield, a multi-turreted medium tank from the interwar period. Its layout and armor were already outdated by 1941, and only a few hundred were available. But when it appeared, the T-28 still carried a respectable gun and a crew that could lay down significant firepower against infantry and light vehicles. At the other end of the spectrum stood the KV-1, a heavy tank that shocked many German crews in the opening battles. Its thick armor made it almost invulnerable to the standard 37mm anti-tank guns used by the Wehrmacht in 1941. In some engagements, single KV-1 South held up entire German columns, forcing them to bring in heavier guns or artillery to deal with this new threat. The KV-1 showed that Soviet designers understood the future of armored warfare, even if the Red Army was not yet ready to use it to full effect. Even more dramatic was the KV-2, essentially a KV hull with a massive turret mounting a 152mm howitzer. Designed to break fortified positions, the KV-2 was slow, tall, and mechanically fragile. But when it worked, its huge gun could devastate bunkers, buildings, and even German tanks with a single hit. The most famous Soviet tank of the war also appeared in 1941, the T-34 with sloped armor, a powerful 76.2mm gun, and good mobility. The T-34 was a generation ahead of many German designs it faced during the first year of the invasion. At the tactical level, poor communications and chaotic command often meant that T-34 units were thrown into battle piecemeal. But whenever it met German panzer units on equal terms, the T-34 proved that the Red Army had created one of the most advanced medium tanks of its time. Tanks were only one part of the battlefield. On the ground, Soviet infantry relied heavily on the 45mm anti-tank gun, model 1937. Light, relatively easy to move, and simple to produce, it gave rifle divisions a way to fight German armor. Against early Panzer I-IS and II-IS, the 45mm gun could still be deadly. But as German armor improved, its small caliber quickly became inadequate. To compensate, the Red Army increasingly turned to its 76mm divisional guns, artillery pieces originally designed to support infantry. In 1941, these guns were often used in a direct fire role, aiming over open sights at approaching German tanks. Their higher muzzle velocity and larger shell made them far more dangerous to German armor than the lighter 45mm guns. Behind them, heavier howitzers like the 122mm M30 provided the Red Army with powerful indirect fire. These guns were used to break up German attacks, smash strongpoints, and cover Soviet withdrawals with barrages of high explosive shells. In the skies, The first Soviet pilots to face Barbarossa often flew the Polikarpov I-16. This stubby pre-war fighter had been advanced in the mid-1930s, but by 1941 it was outdated in speed, range, and armament. Many I-16s were destroyed on the ground in the opening days of the invasion, caught wingtip to wingtip on crowded airfields. Alongside the I-16, newer fighters like the MiG-2, 3, and Yak-1 were just entering service. The MiG-3 excelled at high altitude but was less effective in the low-level dogfights where most combat actually took place. The Yak-1 pointed the way forward, combining better performance and handling. But in 1941, there was simply not enough of these modern aircraft to turn the tide. At the same time, new ground attack and bomber aircraft, like the Il-2 Sturmovik and the P-2, were beginning to appear. The Il-2, heavily armored and armed with cannons and rockets, would later become one of the most feared anti-tank aircraft of the war. But in the chaotic summer of 1941, these powerful machines were still too few to stop the German advance. On the ground, the standard weapon of the Soviet infantryman was the Mosin-Nagant rifle. Simple, rugged, and decades old, it armed millions of soldiers from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Alongside it, the newer SVT-40 semi-automatic rifle offered higher firepower, but it was more complex and never fully replaced the Mosin in frontline units. For close-range fighting, submachine guns like the PPS H-41 would soon become icons of the Red Army, firing pistol-caliber rounds at a very high rate and often equipped with a drum magazine. The PPSH turned Soviet assault troops into fearsome close-quarters fighters. Supporting them, the DP-27 light machine gun with its distinctive top-mounted drum provided sustained automatic fire to pin down German infantry. When proper anti-tank weapons were not available, Soviet soldiers turned to whatever they had, including the famous Molotov cocktail. Simple bottles filled with fuel and ignited, thrown at engine decks and air intakes, became a desperate but sometimes effective way to stop German tanks in cities and forests. These improvised weapons reflected the brutal reality of 1941, a Red Army struggling to slow down the invasion by any means necessary. Taken together, these weapons paint a complex picture of the Red Army in 1941. On one side, obsolete light tanks, worn-out aircraft, and undergunned anti-tank weapons collapsed under the weight of the German blitzkrieg. On the other, heavy tanks like the KV-1, advanced designs like the T-34, and the first Il-2 South and Yak-1 South pointed toward a very different future. As the war dragged on, Soviet industry would build on these foundations, flooding the Eastern Front with modern tanks, aircraft, and artillery. But in the opening months of Barbarossa, these were the weapons that stood in the way of the Wehrmacht's drive toward Moscow.